Charles Mills Manson was born in Cincinnati, then moved through a series of institutions and foster placements that shaped early relationships. As a young adult in California, Manson gathered followers who adopted communal living, music ambitions, and itinerant routines. He cultivated close ties with young adherents, built a loose hierarchy, and embedded the group in fringe counterculture circles around Los Angeles and the desert. Manson's public notoriety arose from conspiracy and murder convictions tied to a series of killings in Southern California. Court records documented his influence over followers, the planning context, and the aftermath of the crimes. The case carried an outsized cultural footprint through photographs, trial coverage, and later retrospectives on media responsibility. Manson's own statements and interviews reinforced the enduring profile, while legal appeals failed to alter the core findings. While serving a life sentence in California, Manson's health declined with age. Prison medical notes and news reports recorded hospitalizations late in life. He died in late 2017 in state custody after complications associated with long-standing illness. California authorities handled post-death procedures under correctional policy, and final arrangements followed standard institutional steps for next of kin and disposition. The body was released and cremated following a contested claims process. There was no burial and no headstone. Ashes were scattered, which means no fixed gravesite exists for visitation or documentation. The lack of a marker eliminates routine cemetery records that might otherwise register plot ownership, maintenance, or memorial inscriptions. The absence of a gravesite aligns with policies that limit the creation of pilgrimage locations for notorious figures. In practice, researchers rely on court files, prison archives, and public records rather than cemetery registers. The resulting historical footprint is paper-bound and audiovisual, not carved in stone, which situates Manson's legacy in documents and broadcasts rather than a plot on a map. Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in the Pacific Northwest in a family structure that shifted during childhood, with close ties to his mother and extended relatives. As a young adult, Bundy moved through university settings and formed relationships that overlapped with political volunteering and law studies. These connections framed his public image as organized and ambitious, while masking the underlying criminal conduct later uncovered through multi-jurisdiction investigations. Bundy's public record centered on arrests, extraditions, and trials across western and southeastern states. Proceedings in Utah, Colorado, and Florida established a timeline of offenses and legal battles, including forensic evidence, witness testimony, and escape incidents that drew national coverage. The final convictions in Florida reflected consolidated prosecutorial work, appellate reviews, and procedural rulings that affirmed the sentences. Media interest remained high, yet the courts focused on evidentiary standards and statutory requirements. In Florida custody, Bundy's appeals narrowed, and prison life grew more regulated under close supervision. Health remained stable until the end, when execution protocols proceeded after final denials of clemency. He died in late January of 1989 at Florida State Prison under capital punishment procedures, with extensive documentation by state officials and contemporaneous reporting that detailed the timeline and witnesses present. Following the execution, authorities released the remains to designated parties for cremation. The ashes were scattered in the Pacific Northwest, a choice that aligned with family connections and avoided the creation of a physical monument. No grave, marker, or cemetery plot records exist for routine genealogical searching or public visitation. This outcome limited opportunities for site-based memorialization and reduced the likelihood of a focal point for notoriety. The absence of a gravesite has shaped the historical record toward court transcripts, law enforcement files, and documentary archives. Researchers reconstruct the chronology through filings, exhibits, and broadcast footage rather than cemetery registers or headstones. In that way, Bundy's public memory is anchored to institutional records, not a marked plot. John Wayne Gacy grew up in a Midwestern household with strict expectations and recurring health issues that influenced early social life. As an adult in Illinois, Gacy cultivated a network through family events, neighborhood gatherings, and business activities tied to construction contracting. He held visible community roles, including charitable performances and local involvement, which shaped a public image that contrasted with later revelations. Gacy's public record turned on extensive investigations, forensic recovery, and multiple convictions that documented a prolonged pattern of harm. Law enforcement excavations at his residence and related sites established a crucial evidentiary base, supported by dental comparisons and later scientific confirmations. Court proceedings detailed victim identifications, timelines, and corroborating testimony. The case left a durable mark on investigative methods for missing persons and post-mortem identification in county and state systems. In prison, Gacy pursued appeals and post-conviction motions that were steadily resolved against him. Health concerns were managed within the correction system, while legal options narrowed. He died in May of 1994 in Illinois after execution by state protocol, with witnesses present and official time of death recorded by prison medical staff. Administrative procedures followed, including confirmation of identity and release of remains under applicable rules. Gacy was buried under an assumed name, and the exact plot was not disclosed in public cemetery records. The choice shielded grounds from vandalism, unwanted attention, and recurrent disturbance. There is no marker that links the burial to his legal identity, and routine genealogical searches cannot confirm a location. The anonymity serves both privacy interests of next of kin and operational needs of the cemetery. The undisclosed burial reflects a broader trend in managing the remains of notorious offenders. Rather than erecting a focal point, officials and families direct attention to court archives, victim memorials, and educational resources on forensic identification. In the historical record, Gacy's presence endures in documents and case files, while the gravesite remains deliberately opaque. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer grew up in Ohio and later Wisconsin in a family negotiating relocations, academic pressures, and parental separation. Early relationships centered on classmates and neighbors, with limited extracurricular anchors. As a young adult, Dahmer lived intermittently with relatives in the Midwest, worked short-term jobs, and maintained a private routine that concealed serious criminal conduct from most acquaintances and family contacts. Dahmer's public record emerged through arrests, evidence recovery, and detailed forensic processing by Milwaukee authorities. Investigators cataloged physical evidence, documented interviews, and coordinated with medical examiners for identifications and cause determinations. Court proceedings in Wisconsin established a comprehensive factual record, including psychiatric evaluations and expert testimony. The convictions resulted in multiple life terms, and public discussion examined policing practices, neighborhood reporting, and oversight of previous encounters with law enforcement. While incarcerated in Wisconsin, Dahmer's daily life followed standard prison assignments and restricted movement. He was subject to institutional rules and periodic assessments of safety and placement. Health was stable until a violent incident in late 1994 within the prison facility. He died in November of that year after sustaining fatal injuries during a work detail, with the official pronouncement made at a nearby hospital following attempted medical intervention. Disputes arose over possessions and rights to the body, and the court reviewed competing claims from parents regarding the disposition of remains. After legal resolution, the state released the body for cremation. The ashes were divided between parents, leaving no gravesite, headstone, or cemetery register to consult. Without a fixed memorial, there is no public plot to visit, and no routine maintenance or inscription records exist in Wisconsin cemeteries for his name. The absence of a gravesite has directed historical attention toward police files, court transcripts, and documented community responses. Researchers rely on exhibits, inventories, and official reports rather than cemetery maps or burial deeds. In this case, the archival trail is institutional and paper-based, reflecting a deliberate choice that avoids creating a physical site associated with the crimes. Aileen Carol Warnos was born in Michigan and raised amid unstable family ties that shifted between relatives and temporary guardians. As a young adult, Warnos moved to Florida and formed relationships within roadside communities, working transient jobs and relying on acquaintances for housing and transport. Correspondence and visitation records show occasional contact with relatives and supporters who followed her legal situation through appeals and media coverage. Warnos's public record is defined by arrests, trials, and multiple convictions in Florida. Court proceedings documented witness statements, forensic findings, and law enforcement interviews gathered across several counties. Appeals focused on procedural issues, representation, and competency questions, yet the judgment stood after review by state and federal courts. Media interest was substantial, but the legal record remained concentrated on evidence and statutory requirements. In Florida custody, Warnos's health was monitored through standard prison medical services while her case moved through final reviews. She declined further appeals near the end and stated her position in filings and interviews. Warnos died in October of 2002 at Florida State Prison under capital punishment procedures, with officials recording times, witnesses, and compliance with established protocols. After death, the state released the remains to designated next of kin. Warnos was cremated, and the ashes were transported to Michigan for scattering at a location associated with family and early life. There is no grave, marker, or cemetery register listing for her name, and no plot is available for visitation or genealogical confirmation. The absence of a gravesite places the documentary record in court files, archival footage, and contemporary reporting. Researchers trace her life through transcripts, exhibits, and public records rather than cemetery deeds or headstones, which aligns with family choices and corrections policy regarding remains. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez grew up in Texas in a large family with strong ties to extended relatives, then moved to California as a young adult. Early relationships involved school peers, short-term employers, and acquaintances in Los Angeles. He spent periods drifting between temporary housing and downtown neighborhoods, maintaining loose connections that left few stable anchors outside family contact and occasional correspondence. Ramirez's public record centered on a high-profile investigation and trial in Los Angeles. Law enforcement compiled forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and ballistic links across multiple incidents, coordinating among local jurisdictions. Court proceedings in California produced convictions on numerous counts, with appellate reviews upholding the outcomes. Media attention was extensive, yet the record remains grounded in documented evidence, courtroom transcripts, and official rulings. Ramirez lived under long-term incarceration in California following sentencing. Health concerns were noted as he aged, including chronic conditions recorded by prison medical services. He died in June of 2013 in state custody at a hospital associated with the correction system. Officials documented the timeline, cause, and administrative steps consistent with standard procedures for deaths of inmates serving lengthy terms. After death, Ramirez was cremated. Authorities and designated parties did not establish a public gravesite or headstone. There is no cemetery plot available for visitation, and routine genealogical searches do not yield a burial record. The absence of a physical memorial limits site-specific documentation, leaving no marker to manage or maintain in public or private cemeteries. For researchers, the historical trail relies on court files, investigative summaries, and corrections records. The lack of a gravesite channels attention to archival materials, police inventories, and appellate opinions. In this case, the documented legacy remains institutional and paper-based, with no public monument to shape memory beyond the official record. Edward Theodore Gein grew up near Plainfield, Wisconsin, in a small household marked by strict religious expectations and limited social contact. Family relations centered on his mother and brother, with sparse ties to peers or community organizations. Neighbors recalled routine farm work and occasional odd jobs, while relatives maintained a distance that left Gein with few enduring friendships beyond immediate family. Gein's public record involved investigations that uncovered grave robbing and homicides linked to his rural property. Sheriff's deputies and state agents cataloged items recovered from the home, photographed scenes, and coordinated with medical examiners for identifications. Court proceedings focused on competency, legal responsibility, and confinement rather than a conventional trial, producing rulings that placed Gein in a state institution. The case influenced discussions about criminal psychology, evidence handling in rural jurisdictions, and the portrayal of crime in popular culture. Gein remained under state supervision for decades, moving between secure hospitals as medical evaluations required. Health declined with age, and records noted chronic conditions associated with long-term institutional life. He died in July of 1984 in Wisconsin, with official documentation recording the cause, place, and immediate steps for custodial remains. Administrators notified relatives and coordinated transportation under routine procedures. Gein was buried at Plainfield Cemetery in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The headstone attracted repeated vandalism and souvenir theft, which led to the removal of the original marker. The grave location is known within the cemetery, and staff maintain records of the plot, yet no prominent stone stands for public viewing. Visitors encounter a modest, largely unmarked presence that reduces disturbance and unauthorized souvenir activity. The burial illustrates how cemeteries balance public curiosity with protection of grounds and family privacy. Instead of a visible monument, researchers rely on court files, hospital records, and local archives to document Gein's life and case history. The plot remains part of community records, while the interpretive narrative resides in institutional documents rather than a prominent marker. Albert Henry DeSalvo grew up in Massachusetts in a working-class household with limited resources and unstable family dynamics. Early relationships formed through neighborhood, school, and military service, followed by marriage and employment in trades that offered steady but modest income. Contacts with law enforcement occurred before the later high-profile confessions, establishing a record of prior offenses and psychological evaluations that shaped subsequent custody decisions. DeSalvo's public notoriety centered on confessions linking him to a series of assaults and homicides popularly attributed to a single offender in the Boston area. Investigators documented his statements, tested leads, and compared details with case files. While debate persisted among analysts about attribution and corroboration, court outcomes focused on separate charges that secured long-term imprisonment. Decades later, forensic reviews, including DNA analysis on specific evidence, informed reassessments of responsibility for particular victims, shaping a more nuanced historical record. While incarcerated in Massachusetts, DeSalvo sought communication with attorneys and correspondents, pressing for recognition of his version of events alongside requests for improved conditions. He died in November of 1967 after being stabbed in custody, with the official pronouncement made following attempted medical intervention. Prison authorities documented the incident and processed next-of-kin notifications under prevailing policy, and investigators recorded interviews related to the circumstances of his death. After release of the body, DeSalvo was interred at Puritan Lawn Memorial Park in Peabody, Massachusetts. Cemetery records list the burial and maintain internal mapping, while the gravesite remains a modest presence without promotional signage. In later years, remains were exhumed for forensic comparison, then reinterred at the same cemetery with documentation entered into both legal and cemetery files. The case occupies a complex position in regional history, where burial records are straightforward, but criminal attribution has been revisited through modern testing. As a result, public understanding relies on a combination of cemetery documentation, court files, and forensic updates that clarify responsibility on an evidentiary basis rather than on reputation alone. Richard Benjamin Speck was born in Illinois and raised amid frequent moves that shaped limited and shifting relationships. Family ties included siblings and a mother who managed relocations and employment changes. As a young adult, Speck worked in manual labor and dockside jobs, built short-term acquaintances in taverns and rooming houses, and maintained intermittent contact with relatives who tracked his employment and arrests through local records. Speck's public records centered on the Chicago case that led to a landmark investigation and trial. Detectives compiled eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and medical examiner findings that established the sequence of events and linked Speck to the scene. Court proceedings documented psychiatric evaluations, motions, and appeals that challenged venue, publicity, and admissibility, while appellate rulings affirmed the core conclusions. Media coverage remained intense, yet the legal outcomes rested on testimony and preserved evidence. In prison, Speck adapted to long-term custody with routine assignments and restricted movement. Institutional reports noted conduct issues, contraband incidents, and periodic transfers within the state system. Health declined over time with chronic conditions associated with aging and incarceration. He died in December of 1991 in Illinois after a medical emergency, with the official pronouncement recorded at a hospital following attempted resuscitation. Following the death, authorities released the body for cremation. Ashes were scattered under arrangements that avoided creation of a burial site. There is no grave site, no headstone, and no cemetery plot listed for genealogical searches or public visitation. This eliminated the need for plot maintenance, signage, or security responses to visitors seeking a marker. The absence of a grave has concentrated historical attention on court transcripts, investigative files, and medical examiner documents. Researchers reconstruct the case through records and preserved exhibits, not through cemetery deeds or memorial inscriptions. In this instance, the legacy exists in institutional archives rather than in a defined place on cemetery grounds. Angelo Anthony Buono Jr. was born in Rochester, then raised in California within an extended Italian-American family that emphasized work and close household ties. As an adult in Los Angeles County, Buono maintained relationships through automotive businesses, neighborhood acquaintances, and family members who interacted regularly at home and at work. He presented as a small business owner with steady routines that masked involvement in serious criminal activity, alongside an associate whose path intersected with his. Buono's public record formed through a joint investigation that connected multiple deaths across Los Angeles. Detectives coordinated interviews, surveillance, and forensic comparisons that identified patterns in victim selection and methods. Prosecutions in California assembled witness testimony, accomplice statements, and physical evidence to produce convictions. Appeals and post-conviction motions addressed evidentiary rulings and procedural claims, yet the judgment stood. The case influenced discussions on interagency cooperation and the handling of complex serial investigations within large urban jurisdictions. While incarcerated in California, Buono lived under maximum security conditions with limited privileges and monitored communications. Health issues associated with aging emerged over time and were managed within the correction system. He died in September of 2002 in state custody, with medical staff documenting cause, time, and notifications to next of kin according to policy. Reports state that Buono was interred at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles. Cemetery staff do not promote the location, and no prominent marker is associated with his name. Public-facing registers provide minimal detail, and the grounds avoid directing visitors to any specific plot. The low-profile approach reduces traffic, discourages vandalism, and protects nearby families from unwanted attention. The reported interment reflects a broader practice for high-profile offenders, where burial occurs within ordinary cemetery operations but without publicity. Researchers rely on court files, investigative records, and archive footage rather than on a visible gravesite. In this case, public memory is anchored to institutional documents, while the cemetery presence remains discreet. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born in Pennsylvania, then moved through a series of relocations that shaped unstable early relationships. Family ties were limited, and adolescent years included time in juvenile institutions that influenced later contacts and habits. As an adult in California, Bittaker worked sporadically in industrial and service jobs, formed short-term friendships, and maintained correspondence that traced his movements through arrests and parole records. Bittaker's public record centered on investigations that linked him, alongside an associate, to multiple abductions and killings in Southern California. Detectives collected witness statements, physical evidence, and vehicle-related findings that tied scenes together. Court proceedings in California documented interviews, exhibits, and expert testimony, producing convictions and a death sentence. Appeals and habeas petitions reviewed evidentiary rulings and counsel performance, yet the sentences remained in place after extensive judicial scrutiny. In state custody, Bittaker lived on death row for decades under strict protocols. Daily life included confined housing, controlled recreation, and medical monitoring for chronic conditions of aging. He died in December of 2019 in a California hospital while still under corrections supervision. Officials recorded cause and time, completed notifications, and closed the inmate medical file in accordance with procedure. After death, Bittaker was cremated. The authorities did not publicize the subsequent disposition, and designated parties did not establish any gravesite or headstone. No cemetery plot is available for visitation, and routine genealogical searches yield no burial record. The undisclosed handling of ashes minimizes the risk of vandalism, unwanted attention, and repeated inquiries to cemetery staff. The absence of a known burial site directs research toward court transcripts, investigative files, and corrections records. For historians and documentarians, the evidentiary trail is institutional and archival, while the final disposition remains private and unmarked. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. grew up in Amityville, New York, within a household marked by strict expectations, frequent conflict, and close ties to extended relatives. Relationships centered on parents and siblings, with neighborhood acquaintances who observed both routine family life and periodic disturbances. As a young adult, DeFeo worked intermittently, spent time with friends in local bars, and maintained a public presence that contrasted with growing tensions at home. DeFeo's public record formed around the homicides at the family residence and the subsequent investigation by Suffolk County authorities. Detectives documented the scene, collected ballistic evidence, and assembled a timeline that tracked movements before and after the event. Court proceedings established responsibility through testimony, physical evidence, and expert analysis, leading to convictions and long sentences. The case later influenced popular culture, though legal records remained separate from later adaptations and commentary. In state custody, DeFeo pursued appeals and post-conviction motions that questioned representation, statements, and forensic interpretation. Courts reviewed filings and affirmed the underlying findings, leaving the original judgments intact. Health issues emerged with age and corrections. Medical staff monitored chronic conditions. He died in March of 2021 in New York State custody, with officials recording cause and time after hospital transfer and notifying designated contacts in accordance with policy. Following death, officials coordinated with next of kin for the disposition of remains. Burial was conducted privately, and the location was not disclosed in public cemetery registers. There is no accessible gravesite, and no headstone is available for routine visitation or genealogical confirmation. Records of the interment are maintained confidentially, consistent with family wishes and institutional practices. The lack of a public burial site has concentrated attention on court files, investigative documents, and contemporaneous news coverage. As a result, the historical trail is archival and legal rather than geographic. Public memory often references the cultural afterlife of the case, yet the physical resting place remains intentionally unknown. James Warren Jones was raised in Indiana within a working-class household where church life, neighborhood ties, and school contacts formed early relationships. As a young adult, Jones married, fostered children, and organized an interracial congregation that emphasized social services, communal labor, and political engagement. The group relocated several times, first within the Midwest and California, then to Guyana, where family members, close aides, and hundreds of congregants lived in an agricultural settlement. Jones's public profile grew through charitable programs, voter outreach, and alliances with civic leaders, while allegations of abuse, coercion, and financial control accumulated in affidavits and press reports. Concerned relatives, organized advocacy groups, and journalists compiled interviews and documents that challenged the movement's practices. Official interest culminated in a congressional visit in November of 1978, when the delegation, defectors, and journalists were attacked at an airstrip near the settlement, producing multiple deaths and triggering a rapid collapse of order. In the hours that followed, Jones's health and stability deteriorated amid recordings, instructions, and chaos within the compound. He died in November of 1978 in Guyana, with Guyanese and United States authorities coordinating recovery, identification, and repatriation. The mass casualty event required refrigerated storage, temporary morgue facilities, and a large-scale identification process supervised by military and medical personnel. Following repatriation of remains to California, many victims were interred at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, where a collective memorial and grave markers list hundreds of names. Jones's remains were also buried at Evergreen, but his name is not included on the principal memorial wall. Cemetery records document the plot and interment, and the grounds maintain a solemn setting that acknowledges the scale of loss for families and communities connected to the congregation. The site provides a focal point for remembrance of the dead, separating the memorial function from the leadership that orchestrated the tragedy. Historical interpretation rests on government reports, depositions, and contemporaneous media rather than personal commemoration of Jones. In this case, the cemetery becomes a civic archive of grief, while the documentary record explains the organizational dynamics and the catastrophic end. Andrew Philip Cunanan was raised in National City and later Rancho Bernardo within a family that balanced work, school expectations, and church life. Relationships formed through classmates, neighborhood circles, and patrons he met in San Diego and later in Northern and Southern California. As a young adult, Cunanan cultivated image-conscious friendships, traveled frequently, and maintained intermittent contact with relatives who followed events through news reports during the final year of his life. Cunanan's public record unfolded across several states in 1997, with investigations coordinated among Minneapolis, Chicago, and Miami Beach. Law enforcement assembled timelines from witness accounts, financial transactions, and travel records, while forensic comparisons linked scenes and recovered items. National attention intensified after a high-profile killing in Miami Beach that placed the case at the center of daily reporting. Agencies issued bulletins, updated composites, and held press briefings as the search continued. During the final week of July in 1997, Cunanan evaded capture while moving within Miami Beach neighborhoods and waterfront areas. He died in July of that year by self-inflicted harm on a houseboat where officers had converged after a tip. The medical examiner documented cause and manner, and investigators cataloged items recovered at the scene, concluding the multi-state search that had occupied federal and local authorities. Following identification and release, Cunanan was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea off San Diego, consistent with family arrangements and maritime scattering practices. There is no gravesite, headstone, or cemetery register listing, and the absence of a plot removes the routine maintenance and visitation associated with burial in a public cemetery. The lack of a physical memorial has left the historical record concentrated in police files, coroner documentation, and contemporaneous media. Researchers reconstruct the final months through travel logs, receipts, and evidence inventories rather than cemetery deeds or headstones. In this case, the archival trail is coastal and institutional, while the sea scattering leaves no geographic marker. Juan Vallejo Corona was born in Mexico and migrated to California, where agricultural labor shaped daily life and relationships. Family ties included marriages, children, and relatives who worked in the same Central Valley economy. Corona held contract to supply field hands, interacted with growers and laborers, and maintained connections within Spanish-speaking communities that recorded his movements through payrolls and housing arrangements. Corona's public record emerged from investigations in the Sacramento Valley in the early 1970s. Sheriff's deputies recovered bodies from orchards near work sites and compiled evidence that linked labor lists, receipts, and tools to Corona's contracting activities. Court proceedings documented witness statements, forensic findings, and expert testimony, resulting in convictions that were later retried and reaffirmed after appellate review. The case influenced regional procedures for migrant worker documentation and missing person reports in agricultural corridors. In prison, Corona lived under long-term custody with periodic medical evaluations and transfers as health needs changed. He maintained limited correspondence and occasional visits, while corrections records tracked conduct and treatment for chronic conditions associated with aging. Corona died in March of 2019 in state custody, with officials recording cause, time, and notifications to next of kin according to policy. Following his death, burial arrangements were kept private. Authorities and family did not disclose a cemetery location, and no headstone is publicly listed. There is no accessible gravesite for visitation or genealogical confirmation, and cemetery staff in the region have not promoted any plot under his name. Records of interment, if any, remain confidential in accordance with family wishes and institutional practices. The lack of a public burial site directs researchers to court files, investigative reports, and agricultural employment records. In this instance, the historical trail is administrative and legal, reflecting a case rooted in labor contracting and rural policing, while the final resting place remains intentionally undisclosed. Dean Arnold Corll grew up in Texas in a household that shifted through divorce and relocations between Houston and smaller Gulf Coast towns. Family relationships centered on his mother, stepfather, and younger brother, with neighbors recalling a quiet adolescent who helped in a family candy business. As an adult, Corll maintained ties with employees and local youths through work, informal gatherings, and small favors that positioned him as a familiar presence in the neighborhood. Corll's public record, formed after disappearances in the Houston area, drew police attention and family advocacy. The case reached a turning point in August of 1973 when associates provided statements that led detectives to multiple locations. Investigators recovered extensive physical evidence, coordinated exhumations, and documented identifications through medical examiner files and dental comparisons. The case reshaped local procedures for missing person reports, interagency coordination, and systematic searches of suspected burial sites. Corll died in August of 1973 during a confrontation inside a Houston area residence. The death was recorded by local authorities, with scene processing, witness interviews, and ballistic documentation entered into the official file. Subsequent investigative work focused on mapping the broader timeline, identifying victims, and consolidating evidence for prosecutors, while families sought answers and memorial arrangements. Reports indicate that Corll was interred at Grandview Memorial Park in Pasadena, Texas. The gravesite is not prominently marked in public materials, and cemetery staff do not promote the location. Routine registers exist internally, but the grounds maintain a low profile that discourages attention and protects nearby families. There is no public monument, and visitors are not directed to any plot associated with his name. The reported interment reflects a practical approach to managing notoriety within ordinary cemetery operations. In historical review, Corll's presence appears mainly in police files, medical examiner records, and local archives. Memorial focus has shifted toward victims and community remembrance, while the burial remains discreet within cemetery records.